Hello and welcome. This is Working Class to World Class. But before we go any further, I do have a little favour of you. If you could hit that follow or subscribe button, then that would be a massive help. Thank you. In this episode, you hear the captivating story of a music supervisor's journey all the way from a religious household in Waco, Texas. He took on the world and he proved that he could do it. He now works with some of the global superstars, the likes of Lil Wayne, Chamillionaire and Pitbull. Breaking through the barriers of adversity. I'm Lynn Lester, and this is Working Class to World Class. Scott, welcome to Working Class to World Class. It's really good to catch up again.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Lynn.
Yeah, so where are you based? Are you in somewhere exotic?
If by exotic you mean LA, I'm in Los Angeles. It seems to be everyone thinks it's beautiful weather, things like that, but it's been terrible the past couple months.
Oh,
Gross,
really?
rainy. Yeah, we just got more rain than Seattle in the past year, which is a little crazy. So usually we're known for 75 and sunny all year round, and it's been dreary and rainy.
Wow, maybe we're reversing
It's
things
weird.
because in Scotland it's very dry today. So there you go, dry and sunny, freezing, but at least it's a
Yeah,
degree notch up.
it's it's 50 right now. It's crazy.
Oh God. So the thing is, people are probably going, oh my God, how boring starting a podcast off talking about the weather. It just makes me feel good about myself if I know you're getting it worse. So for everyone tuning in, could you give an update on who you are? Who is Scott?
Yeah. So I am originally from a small town in Texas called Waco. And a lot of people know Waco because there was a very large skirmish, if you will. There was a large cult uprising that was in Waco called the Branch Davidian, and it was international news in the 90s. And so usually Waco has like a nice little black stamp on the map because it always has this kind of like stain of this crazy world. I am a music supervisor. So I am the person who picks out music for TV shows, movies, commercials, podcasts, new media platforms, things like that.
Well, it sounds sexy and exciting. So for people that I know are tuning in, I'll be like, okay, I now I'm interested. So what would be lovely is to sort of get a sense of this place that you talk about. It's got the black mark on the map.
Yeah.
What's it like? What is sort of culture there? Just to sort of set the scene so that I kind of gives it context.
Yeah, Waco it's a pretty small town. I was raised very Southern Baptist Republican. So if that kind of like sets the scene, especially in Texas right now, Texas is in the news a lot right now with Florida and a lot of other, states, especially with what's going on in the US right now. But yeah, I was raised very Christian, very Republican, very sheltered. I think one of the reasons why I got into music is because I was very, like I said, sheltered. I was not allowed to listen to anything except Christian music for a long time. I wasn't allowed to see any type of movie that was above, like, or that was PG-13, rated PG-13 or above, unless my parents had gone to see it, and just very sheltered. And so, and that was the case for, I guess, a lot of my friends. So for the longest time, it just didn't feel like it was out of the norm. And it wasn't until I went to college and people were just like, what? Like, yeah. So Waco was great, but it was a bubble. You lived in such a bubble, and you're just like, I didn't grow up knowing a lot of outside Waco. And yeah, it was such a small world, and it was such an it was such a weird place to grow up. And but I just hadn't I like when you grow up in a certain place, you're just like, this is home. This is kind of like what I think everywhere else is like. And it took me moving to all these different places to realize, whoa, like that, whoa. So
Yeah, exactly. You don't know what you don't know, do you? And that's partly why I do this podcast because it's like you can't be what you can't see. And so
yeah.
that as you say, you're in this sort of bubble, you're very sheltered from the rest of the world, then your eyes open wide and you're like, wow, oh blooming heck, what goes on over there?
Yeah.
And so for your kind of upbringing then, talk to me who was in the household.
Yeah, so I have a younger sister who's 2 years younger than me, and then my parents. Um, my mom was is I guess still a speech pathologist, and that's essentially someone who works with people who have speech impediments or speaking disabilities. She worked a lot with like kids, so she worked in schools, a lot. So it was for kids who had like a lisp, or they couldn't say their R's, or their it just anything essentially that wasn't progressing at a normal speed when you wouldn't learn how to say a word correctly. So she was a speech pathologist and audiologist. Um, yeah, she worked in schools. She was worked in elementary schools. Um, my dad was a federal probation officer. So he worked for the government, and he was essentially a person who, if you were released from like prison, like a federal prison, um, you had kind of like someone who you were on probation, and so you had like an ankle monitor, or something like that. You would have to check in. He was kind of like your your dad. You had to tell him when you're going places. You had to check in. He had to, if you wanted to go somewhere, he had to approve it. And they were very gang related. A lot of the people that he was working with were gang affiliates, or offenders of some sort on a federal level. So I don't
Yeah.
really know a ton because everything was classified, but like so it was very interesting because sometimes he would just be gone for like weeks, and just like didn't know
Yeah.
where he was, kind of thing. And my mom was just kind of like, this is kind of it, so um but yeah, it was very interesting. I very much remember like all like before cell phones and things like that, he would get, pages all the time. You get paged all the time, and he would call, and I still remember his like ID number, and things like that, because it was, have to call in and say this is, whatever it is, and we give him his ID number, and it was just so like still to this day I remember it, and when the Branch Davidian stuff happened, I was two. He was there. Everyone was on scene. It was crazy. It was just a very weird, I guess, profession. It's very. There's a show, like it's called Criminal Minds. It's very like similar to like what he did. So, but yeah, and then I have a sister. Like I said, she's 2 years younger. She was a dancer, and is still a dancer. She works in interior design now. But yeah, she was a dancer. I was a swimmer growing up, so I was a really competitive swimmer. And yeah, my dad played football in college. Um, and yeah, we were very Texas. We were very Texan. We loved our football. We loved the sports. We weren't country. We weren't like a country household. We didn't listen to like a lot of country music because remember, we only were allowed to listen to Christian music. So, but yeah, yeah, that's just kind of a little background. Yeah.
I mean, it sounds like a really nice setting, but as you say, when you're a kid, there's certain nuggets that you just remember, certain things. Even now, my son will say, I remember when I was three, you did this. And it's like, either you're just making it up or you really remember. And I do think he does remember certain things. And often it's like
Yeah.
something that's just out of the ordinary. But you're talking about your dad being away. I mean, my dad used to work in newspapers and
Yeah.
the press halls, and he was away for like days on end. And I'm probably like that now in my job, but he would be away for a few days, say away for three, back for four, away for seven, back for two. And it was like it was only going down the south of England. So, but for me, I was always excited every time he came back because he was coming
Yeah.
back to the house, and he'd always have some sweets or something that we would get to him,
Yeah,
which I
he would always
loved.
like try. He would always bring something, but it was never like it couldn't be like descriptive, of like where he was. It was like he would
Yeah.
bring like some candy or something because it's gonna be like, oh, I was in, wherever because we weren't allowed to know, where that was. So yeah,
That's crazy. And so, in terms of your sort of, I mean, the upbringing sounds, I mean, obviously, we'll talk about the Christianity stuff in a minute because I'm quite
yeah.
intrigued by it. But, in terms of the sort of living a life, going on holidays, doing kind of extravagant things. I mean, obviously, this podcast is working class to world class. And I know from chatting to you before, there was much
hmm
adversity along the way. So, yeah, it'd be great to get an insight into what that looked like.
Yeah, I mean, we we tried to take like a vacation every year. but sometimes we were working. We weren't, like we weren't. I think we were lower-ish middle class. I guess if that kind of like sets a scene right there. Like our house was 1,200 square feet. It wasn't anything big. It was. I never had my own bathroom until I was in college. I had to share with my sister. And my my dad. I remember my great grandmother passed away when I was like 8, and she left him this car, and this car was so ugly. It was like, oh gosh, it was like a 19, I don't know, like a 19 like 87. It was like a celebrity. And I think it was like a Pontiac Celebrity. I think that's what it was. And it was pea green. Like this car was so ugly. And the left door didn't open, and the left passenger door didn't open. And I was so embarrassed to be seen in this car. But this is the car that he drove because, like we didn't have a ton of money. And and that's it was so embarrassing. I was so embarrassed to be seen in this car. And um my mom, when we would take vacations, I think my mom, they like saved a ton, and we bought a Suburban, and I thought I was so cool when we had the Suburban right when they came out. And we never flew anywhere, never. My parents didn't want to, they didn't want to spend the money on that. Then when they said we have a car and we can drive, and that can save a couple $1,000s, which in hindsight, yeah, it's true. And so we would drive every single place we went. And I remember this one time we were going to New York. My dad has a brother who lives in New York, and so we drove from Waco, Texas to upstate New York, and that was, I don't know, it was like a 19-hour drive. And we ended up having to sleep in a parking lot at one point. We were like 3 hours outside of New York, and my dad just drove, and he was like, I don't want to spend the money on that. So we're gonna sleep in the parking lot of, I think it was like a Denny's or something like that. He was like, I just need like 2 hours. So, and I like clearly remember that. And then we had a great time. We went to New York. We had some cousins, but it was just like, I remember I'm like, why can't we just sleep in a hotel, and it was like, we don't want to have to spend the money, on sleeping in a hotel. And, it was all these like little things that it just like baffled me until I like got older, and now I had, kids and things like that, and it was just like, wow. So yeah, it was a lovely vacation. I remember I ended up winning a parrot at this fair, and I was told I couldn't bring this parrot home, and I was so upset. And I still remember that, to this day, that they were like, you have to give this parrot away. And I was so upset by it. But yeah, it was a great vacation. But I clearly remember, I'm like, I thought it was so weird that we couldn't stay, we couldn't sleep in a hotel. Um, and yeah, it was, we did other vacation, but like I said, we always drove everywhere we went to. If we went to Florida, we went to like, I think we went to Disney one year. We slept in the hotel the farthest away. And my parents always wanted to give us everything that they could. And my dad was from a very poor family. Growing up, he had 8 brothers and sisters, and they lived in I think it was a 2-bedroom house for 8 brothers and sisters plus mom and a dad. And so it was, yeah, it was a lot. So he always like tried to take care of us and make sure that we never wanted for anything. So he was the one who sacrificed. He was the one who drove the terrible pea green car so he could save the money for us to be able to take a vacation, or to put something away for a college fund or something like that. So, for stuff that he didn't have, So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like cutting your cloth accordingly. It did make me laugh when you told the parrot story because it's just case in point, isn't it? You cast up all the things that happened to you as a kid.
Yeah.
Oh, you and my son we got on really well. So talk me through the sort of Christianity thing because you sort of mentioned a few trigger words which I want to sort of hone in on. So one was a Christianity and one was it was like a
Yeah.
cult. So what does
Yeah.
that mean in practice?
Well, I mean, I was raised Christian, so not Catholic. And that was and specifically Southern Baptist. So that's like a whole, I guess there are varying forms of Christianity, but like Southern Baptist is like Baptist in general is, I guess, one of the bigger branches of Christianity. So a lot of the Republican Party are, Baptist adjacent, something like that. And it was interesting growing up in like a small town because, I'm gay, and also I, I wasn't one of those people who just just wanted to settle for living in Waco. So it was one of those, I have dreams, I want to move out and make it big, and I think everyone does, but it was just like, how do I do that? How am I going to get out of it? Was always like, how am I going to get out of Waco? And even though I didn't know, even though I was like, oh, I love this is Waco, this is great, things like that, I was always like, this is not where I'm going to end up. And I always knew I wasn't going to end up there. And Waco was very much a place. There's a college in Waco, Baylor University. It's a fairly well known college, but it's small. It's 10,000 undergrad, um, and I just kind of knew that I didn't want to end up there. A lot of people after high school, and they would go to either like the community college or something like that, and they would stay. They would become like a teacher. They would work at a bank. They would work at whatever. And I was like, I don't want that. I was like, I think I always remember. I was like, I always remembered in like kindergarten when they asked, you're like, what do you want to be when you grow up? And they're like, I want to be a rock star. I want to be a doctor. I want to be, whatever it was. And and I was just like, when in our lives did we kind of like lose sight of just like having like a crazy dream and not being afraid to just like fail at it? I think sometimes people are just so afraid to fail and not accomplish what they're setting out to do, that they look for something that's comfortable. Um, and I was terrified to fail because every time I tried something new, it was in a new place. I had no help. I had nobody that I knew. And I am a crippling introvert. So all of those things combined were just, it was my literal worst nightmare. So, but yeah, I mean, Waco was this weird place, and I think it was because of the upbringing, because of, the Christianity aspect. I remember my first album, my first CD that I ever bought that wasn't a Christian album was Evanescence, The Open Door, and it was like Bring Me to Life, things like that. And still to this day, like that is like my jam. Like it brings back like so many memories of like when I was in seventh grade, and I was on this like we did these like quote unquote mission trips, and I was in like youth group at church and things like that. And we went to like Atlanta or something like that, or we were in the Atlanta airport for some reason. And this album had come out, and I said, I'm gonna buy this album because my parents weren't there. And I bought the album, and I secretly like listen to this album, and yeah, so I mean, like it was like that's when I discovered. I go, oh my gosh, like there's so much music out there that I have no idea about, like not even like classic stuff, like the Beatles or like Leonard Skinner, Led Zeppelin, like anything classics. My parents just didn't. It was weird. My parents didn't really listen to music. Like when we would like go somewhere, they would listen to like talk radio or silence. And I was just like, what? And so I just like, it was always so, or if we did, it was on the Christian radio station, and I think we started a little bit later, started to listen to country because country was at least clean, because if there's anything suggested, like suggestive in the song, it would just like immediately, I would be so uncomfortable talking about sex, talking about, your body, talking about anything. Like you just didn't do it. It was very weird. It was a very weird, like shackling way to grow up, not being able to talk about you or how your body was changing, or just anything. Because I think when you grow up in, especially like a religious household, especially in Christianity, Southern Baptist, very much it's, you don't talk about sex, you don't talk about anything, you don't talk about anything that is suggestive, because that is a sin and that means you're going to hell. And so it was one of those things growing up, and I was like, cool, I'm gay, does that mean I'm going to hell, and immediately? So that's kind of like the mentality that you kind of grew up with. And I was expected to be in church at least 3 times a week, so it was like, oh, here we go, 18 years of growing up in this church where you're told to be amazing and great and kind to others, but it doesn't matter how good you are because you're automatically going to hell because you're gay. And so it was just like kind of growing up with that in the back of your mind. It was just kind of like cool. You're just like, great, I'm already screwed from day one. So
Yes,
so
what's the point?
yeah, I was like, what's the point? So I was kind of like, I just like, "Ah, God, there's got to be more out there than this. Like, this cannot be just like what this is because this is shitty, Like, this is like not what I set out to, this is not what I want for my life. So,
Yeah. I mean, you're
yeah.
obviously a very upbeat person. You tell the story and you've got great optimism. But, back in the day, seriously, but when you were sort of, you realised you were gay, and I'm not sure from what age. So my question would be, well, how did your parents cope with that? When did they find out and how did they cope? And how did you feel being in that environment where you felt that you weren't good enough for what they wanted you to be?
Yeah. Oh God, that's a loaded question. I think it's like a four-parter. I think it's very weird. I still sometimes don't feel like I ever measured up to what they kind of had in mind for me because what they had in mind for me was, someone who is immediately going to make money, someone who was immediately successful, who didn't have to struggle, a doctor, a lawyer. And I wanted to be like, I'm barely getting to the threshold where I would be a successful doctor, or something like that was like just be getting out of school kind of thing. But my parents they were very smart. Like each of them had like 4 degrees, each, so they were super smart and so they were like, they expected that. They expected straight A's. They expected, if I didn't get straight A's, I would get in trouble. Where I had like friends who would like, they're like, oh, my grandparents give me $100 every time I get an A. I'm like, $100 for, I was like, what is this? Yeah. And like, it was crazy. I, I think that the Christianity thing as well, it, it caused me to I guess have to seek out. I guess it caused me to seek out and like form my own music taste. Because a lot of times, like when I talk to people, it's like, well, where did your music taste come from? They're like, oh, my parents. They loved, whoever it was. Like, I grew up on Bowie. I grew up on Etta James. Like all these people, and a lot of them come back to them and go, nothing. Like it was like nothing. So I think my music taste ended up coming from my sister, actually. My sister was a dancer, like I said, growing up, and we would always travel for her, I guess dance competitions, and we would go, and it would be like this top 40 songs that you would have heard on the radio, like when like NSYNC came out, it would be like Bye Bye Bye, and that was the time that I ended up hearing a lot of that music. And I think when I was 13, my parents ended up letting me listen to Radio Disney, which was like this kid-friendly radio station. They would play very clean music, nothing suggestive, like so there'd be a lot of that. So I think one of the reasons why I ended up going into music and TV and film was because I wasn't allowed to watch anything. And growing up in a small town being gay, and it was like I always knew that I was, like even from like day one I always knew, but like I knew I was, but I didn't know, like I guess the word.
Yeah.
And it was like, oh, attracted to boys kind of thing. I was like, yeah. And but again, I was the only one. I didn't know, none of my friends were growing up, and it wasn't until like I moved a lot like I moved like a lot later on, like college, something like that, that a couple of them like came out of like the woodwork that I would like hear, through the grapevine or something like that. Oh, so and so, is gay, or it's just like what, and it was just like it was lonely sometimes being the only kid that you thought you were, that you were the only person. You didn't have anybody to talk to, older, younger, or your age. You were told that what you are is wrong. And like you didn't see yourself reflected on, in TV or in music. And so it was just like it was a lot of just like trying to figure out like what even, and it was like what even am I doing here? It was like almost like the Billie Eilish song, it's like what was I made for kind of thing. Um and so it was very much like I was always like trying to like hunt for something, and trying to find, where I belonged and what I guess I was like trying to find, I was like, what do I even like about myself? Because I think at that time I was like, I didn't really like anything. Because if you talk to a lot of, people who are queer, it's like you go through this whole period of like, I hate myself. I don't like myself. I don't want to be like this. Like this is not what I want to be. And then it takes you years and years and years and decades to be like, cool, I'm cool with myself. I like myself. I'm happy with who I am. I'm happy with where I am. I didn't even come out until I guess towards the end of college. And it was because I had to move. I couldn't be in the same city with my parents because I couldn't. I just couldn't do that. I didn't feel supported. My parents also worked really hard to make sure that they could pay for college, and they could pay for college and I could also be comfortable. I wouldn't have to get a job. I wouldn't have to do because my parents said because education was really important to them. And they said that we don't want you to have to work. We want your job to be school. So I was really fortunate in that way, and I got the full college experience. I joined a fraternity. Like it was fun, and that's actually going to school was actually how I got into my first music job. Um, and before that I had been really into music because of my sister when she would go and dance. Like I said, we would go to these meets and or these competitions, and she would hear herself say she would hear herself so she would hear all these other songs, and she was like, but it would be the same song over and over and over. Everyone was like, what is the most popular song? Let's dance to it because it was recognizable. And my sister was like, no, like I don't want to be like that. So we would go on Sundays after church. My mom would like drop us off at like Best Buy, and we would go and we would listen to music. We would have to tell her, so we're going to go listen to some, whatever, try to find something for Annie to dance to. And at one point she had just said, why don't you pick out the music and then I'll dance to it. So that was kind of like my first taste into kind of like what I would kind of turn into a little bit later in life is I essentially started like music supervising for my sister when she danced. And I had no idea what it was. So I was like, that was really fun. And it was really cool to like help someone tell a story through music. And and that kind of like led into other things. I ended up getting really involved in like choir in like school, like from like an early age. And like I think like seventh grade, it was eighth grade actually when I joined choir for the first time, and it was like a select choir, so you had to audition. And um and I had played piano, and I was like, I guess I can sing. And they wanted me to come in, and they had to sight read a piece. So they had us like audition. We had to audition on the Star Spangled Banner. And so like the national anthem for the US. And so we had to sing that song, and then we had to sight read a piece. I and so I went in and I auditioned, I sang the song, and um I remember like getting ready to sight read, and they gave me this piece, and I just like I choked. And they wanted us to sight read on solfege, so like do re mi fa sol, like they wanted us to sight read with solfege. And I panicked, and I started sight reading on color, and they were like, what did you just do? And I have a condition called chromesthesia. It's a form of synesthesia, which means I see color with sound. And growing up, I had always had it, and I always thought it was just like a thing. And so when I auditioned and I just started sight reading on color, I had told them, I go, I don't really know solfege, and so I did it on color. I hope that's okay. And they're like, what? Like, what do you mean you just did it on color? And they were just like, okay, like they just kind of like cool. And I was like, it was such a weird reaction because I thought everyone had this. So I was like, it was just like I had no indication that no one that this is like a weird freak thing. And then like it wasn't until like I asked my sister later on. I made the choir, by the way. So really proud of that.
Well
And
done.
and then I was like, I told my sister, and I was like, I choked. And then I sight read on color, and they looked at me like I was crazy. And And she was like, "What are you talking about?" And so I told her, I was like, "I see like colors with sound. Like, so anytime I see anything tonal, I see a color, with it. Like people's voices, a car horn, every single note in a song, I see a color associated with it, chord progression, like it's just everything." And she was like, "That's not a thing." And I'm like, so I was like, "Okay, cool. Another thing that makes me a freak. I'm really excited about this." Um, and so it wasn't until college later that I actually got to do this really cool thing. They did a brain map of me, and they could see all of like the neurological activity and the misfirings. Essentially, it's so chromesthesia or synesthesia is the overlapping of two senses that shouldn't be working together. So if you're hearing something, there's a cross wiring. So something is miscommunicating, and these wires are overlapped in your brain, where one sense is being activated, but at the same time, it's causing a misfire, and it's causing another one of your senses to react in unison with that other sense. So people there's a ton. It was really fascinating to kind of like dig into it and kind of like learn. And so I was like, oh, this is actually something kind of cool. You know, little did I know that I would use it a ton when I, got older. And it was just it was really fascinating to kind of like, add that. I was like, okay, great. This is another failure. This is another like thing that just makes me different. And I was like, you are at the age where you didn't want to be different. You wanted to be like everyone else. You wanted to be a popular kid. You wanted to be liked. And I was none of those. And I just remember like thinking, I was like, okay, I just need one thing. I need one thing that I can be good at. And I was good at sports, but I was like, music ended up being like kind of like my safe haven, and I did music all the way through high school, and I made like this all-state choir that I was really excited about, which meant I was like one of like the top 10. I was a baritone. I was like one of the top 10 singers um in my in the state. And so I was really proud of that. I was like, okay, maybe there's something, to this. And it was my choir teacher who just kind of made me fall in love with music. And it was really fun. So it was all this kind of like evolution and all these like little things that didn't make sense to me. Like, okay, great, this is weird about me. This is weird about me. This is even weirder, you know, and me just trying to like get away from everything in Waco and taking all this like weird stuff, all this weird baggage that I thought was just like, I don't want this, like get this away. So it was just all like it was all about figuring out these like weird things and like putting them in a bag and having them carrying them around all the time when all you just wanted to do was like drop it and just like start over. And so that's kind of like what college ended up being. It was no one knows me, and I think that's what everyone looks at like university. They're like, great, I can be someone totally different. And I was so excited to be totally different. So I was like, I'm going to be the douchey frat guy because I wasn't that in college. I wasn't that in high school. And let's go. And I look back and I was like, God, I was like, I was not a great person then because I think it was like you were so much struggling to try to figure out, great, I can be someone different. Let me try this out. It was, trying out different personalities, trying to figure out who you were. And I I ended up getting connected with a girl who was in a sister sorority of ours, and she was like, I'm working at this label and this music label, and I need an intern. I'm like, I'm there. And I was in college, and I was a vocal performance major. So I was already in school. I was singing. That was going to be my chosen profession, or at least like working in the music world. My parents were not excited about that at all. So in order to like make them calm down, I said, great, I'll double major. So I double majored in business and then also in vocal performance. So I started out as jazz. I started out as opera, so I was an opera performance major, and then I ended up switching to jazz because opera I think just like triggered me in a way because it's all about perfection, and growing up, perfection was what was expected. And I was like, it was, if you were not singing it exactly how it's written, it is wrong. There's no room for interpretation unless it's written, in the music that it's open for interpretation. It is sung the way that it is. And when I switched to jazz, this is freeform. This is, like a lot of the jazz style is make it up as you go, like have fun with it, experiment, and that was like what I liked. I liked the experimental nature of jazz. And so, um, anyways, I got this opportunity to work for this label, and it ended up being a hip hop label, which my parents were even less thrilled about. Like my grandma called me at one point, and she was like, "Can't you just work for a nice Christian like music label? I can make a couple calls." And I'm just like, and so it's always fun for me to kind of like throw back in like parables of like Christianity and like my family's face, because they were like, "No, no, no, you just need to hang out with other Christians." And I'm like, "No, no." I was like, if you read the Bible, Jesus didn't do that. He hung out with the hookers. He hung out with the drunks. He hung out with like the people that no one else wanted to hang out with. And it was like, I'm like, yeah. And I was like, great. And so that was like my kind of like excuse. And they're like, okay, so they kind of like backed down a little bit. But I ended up working in hip hop. And that ended up being kind of like my gateway into music. And I ended up it was very weird because Texas doesn't have a huge music scene. A lot of people, I mean, Austin, yes, Austin's live music, you have South by Southwest, but it wasn't like there were huge acts coming out of Texas. I mean, we had Beyonce, you know, which is huge, but it's Houston, but she quickly moved out, like it wasn't,
Yeah.
that's what a lot of people did. It was great. They were here at a certain point and they moved out. It wasn't like I'm born and raised, I'm staying here. Not like in Nashville, where it's, very much a music scene. Um, but I got this really cool opportunity, and I'm like, I'm not going to have another opportunity like this. So I took it, and I ended up getting to work with Play and Skills. They ended up being my bosses, and they were really big producers in the 90s, and we ended up actually they got a huge flame, a rekindling, if you will. And we got to work with Lil Wayne. So I was part of the team that produced the Carter 3 and the Carter 4 for Lil Wayne. I got to help produce Riding Dirty by Chamillionaire, that was huge. And I got to work with a lot of like the hip hop scene in like Atlanta and Miami. So like Pitbull, Timbaland, a lot of that kind of hip hop. And so I was just like this little kid who had no idea. I was like, I didn't grow up listening to hip hop. I had nothing, and I stuck out like a sore thumb. And, it was very like, you know, c- very, I stuck out, I was like the polo. I was like, I wear a polo and khakis, and things like that. And that is not what you think of when you think of the hip hop world. And, um, but I was good at what I did. I had an ear. And so I ended up doing A&R development, which is very much like a dead art. And it was essentially the person who would go out and sign talent based on talent, and then you develop them. You spent years, you put them in songwriting sessions, you trained them, you did, it was that, and that's not what it is these days. It's we want you to already have that done. We don't want to, labels are looking at it. Well, great. Well, we're not going to sign you unless you have 20 million, Instagram followers or TikTok followers, and at least a million streams, for every song that you have released on Spotify. I'm like, yeah, but people, like I don't know. I'm very cynical in that point, that people just don't want to invest in creating art, as much as they did in the past. But yeah, I ended up working at that label, and I was like, you know what? I want to do something in music. And I wanted to do something, I just didn't know what. And I knew I didn't want to be a singer, because I was like, I'm not good. I was like, I'm not a good enough singer to make it in the world. I think I had a very like Disney voice, like a Broadway style voice. And I was like, I don't want that. I don't want to be a singer. I don't want that. But how do I take this degree? How do I take this music degree and use it, for something? I was always told, I had always had to like tell myself, I was like, okay, great. You need to do what you like. Right after college, I had a couple of jobs that I absolutely hated. I had a job that was making a ton of money, and I hated it. I absolutely hated it. I was like, and my parents and I had, massive, just arguments about that. I was like, you need to make money. And I was like, I don't like it. I would rather live on the street than, have a job that makes me miserable. And so I quit the job. I quit it, and I was like, I'm gonna go to grad school. And I ended up going to Berklee College of Music. And I, again, being the overambitious person, I think because of my parents, I did a double master's in music supervision and music business. And my senior year not my senior year, my second year into my master's program, my final year, one of my professors got me an internship in LA. And I decided that I was going to, my choices after graduation were either LA or New York. And being in Boston, it's freezing. And I'm like, I'm from Texas. I was like, we didn't have crazy winters. So it's like, I'm going to go to LA. And I think it was really funny because I always remember in my mind, like in high school, I think like we would go to friends' house and because I wasn't allowed to watch, any shows on MTV or anything like that. But at the time, I think The Hills was on. And I always had this dream. I'm like, one day I'm gonna live in LA. I'm gonna live in the Hollywood Hills. Like that's me. And so I always had like these like lofty goals. Like and I told all my friends, I'm like, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna channel my Lauren Conrad and I am gonna live in the hills. And um I get this internship and I move to LA and I work with a very well-known music supervisor and I was ecstatic. It was just like this is it. But I was an intern. So I was making no money, or anything like that. So I was trying to figure out how I was going to do anything, and so I remember at one point when I had moved to LA, um like I said, I didn't know anybody, so I was staying at someone's place while they were not there. And it was in K-Town, it was in Koreatown, which is on the east side of LA. And for whatever reason, everyone always ends up in K-Town. I think when they first move, if they don't know a lot of people and they don't know the area, because it's usually the cheapest place. But it's like it's shady. It's real shady. And um I like the amount of times I had my like spare tire stolen off the back of my car, or so like all the time. And it was just I had, no money. I think I was making like, oh my gosh, like maybe $1,000 a month. And, so my parents were trying to like send me some stuff, some money while I was like looking for something. And then I found this apartment in the West Side, which is like, near like Santa Monica. And I they were doing some renovations on it and it was shared with like three other guys, so it was very cheap, but I couldn't move in for like 4 weeks. And my parents they're like, well, we'll send you some money so you can at least find like a hostel or something like that, something that was like $30 a night to stay in. And I was like, no, I'm not gonna do. I was like, no, I'm not gonna do that. I'm just gonna be homeless. And so I did. I was like, I took the money that they had given me and I just saved it because I'm like, I was like, I'll sleep in a nice part. I was like, I slept in my car, like I packed everything up. I slept in my car. And it's like, let me just go to a nice part of Santa Monica where there was like the residential side where I can just sleep. And I was like, I'll go to the gym, I'll shower in the morning, and then I'll go to work. And by that time, I had found like a job. It was a contract job at Universal um, Music doing developmental A&R. Um, and so I was doing that part time, and then I was doing this internship part time, and I was living in my car for a month. And it was just like because I wanted to save the money because I was making no money, and I was like, great, if I can get this extra, money, I can just save it away. Then I don't have to like I I don't have to be forced to eat McDonald's for a meal because it was $1.29 to get a burger, or something like that. And so um I ended up, I got a tattoo. It was funny. I got a tattoo when I turned 18 and it says surprise me God. And it was because I was raised Christian, but it's actually the name of a book. And the book it wasn't that great, but I liked the idea of the concept. And it was essentially put me in a position that makes me uncomfortable or introduce me or, make me talk to somebody that I wouldn't normally talk to or go out of my way to talk to. And because I'm such an introvert, it's always been really hard for me to, just like walk up to somebody and say, hello, how are you? And like strike up a conversation. And just like, I would rather, I think I'd rather have to like eat like a diaper, than like have to go like interact with somebody than just like walk into a room. Like walking into a room where I know nobody it really is like one of my nightmares still to this day. And I was just like, I have to do this. I have to make myself personable. I have to talk to people because that's how things happen, especially in LA, and that was like literally how my first job happened is I was standing in line to get a burger and I met this guy who worked at Universal and I told him, this is what I'm doing. And he goes, oh, I have an internship. And so that's how that internship happened because I was like, I just talked to this guy. And it always comes back to, man, it was such a happenstance kind of thing. I was just in the right place at the right time. And, I think that, things that I learned along the way helped me become a little bit more confident. But it was so much of just like learning, boots on the ground, survival mode, just trying to claw for everything that I could know, and learn, from wherever I could. And then I ended up getting to work on these really great shows. So I got to work on things like Grey's Anatomy and How to Get Away with Murder and Scandal. And so I was like, I got a taste of just like what music supervisors do on like a hugely successful scale. And I was like, great, this is it. Like I made it. And I'm gonna work for this company forever. And then my internship ended, and they're like, "Sorry, we don't have any more room to hire anybody." And I'm just like, "No," And I was like, I was such into a rhythm, and the music supervisor world is really small. Like I don't know, 1,000, and that's like all over the world. Like there are not, and I think that might be padding the numbers a little bit, And then you take music supervisors who are also you're also able to make like a livable wage on being a music supervisor. And that's, God, maybe 10%, and it all kind of goes back to, COVID and all of the writer strikes and the actor strikes that have happened, in LA over the past couple years. And so it was just like a lot of that, was when I got, when that internship was over, I'm like, what do I do? Like, how do I do this? Like I didn't know what to do. So, um, I went into I ended up getting a job and working with music festivals. And I just because I had a good year, I ended up becoming like a booker and then I did live event production. So I specialize in the lowliners and the midliners. So the guys that you never heard of, like when you went to Coachella or like Lollapalooza or Austin City Limits or anything like that. I was the one who was looking for the mid and lows that were coming through to introduce new music because that's what I love to do. That's, like that was like my job. That's always been kind of like my job is searching for music that people don't know about and telling them. Because I was always the person, like who a commercial would come on and be like, oh, that's Vampire Weekend, or that's, Bon Jovi, or whoever it is. I knew it and I knew the album it was on. And I would go to a party and people were like, oh, Scott, put on a playlist, So I always had like a playlist ready to go. And and so I was like, okay, great, maybe this is it. And I I moved up pretty quickly, um and I really enjoyed doing that, but it was a lot of work. It was really hard. It was a really thankless job. It's a lot of long hours, It's like sometimes 18-hour days and 60-hour weeks. It was just a lot. And and then COVID happened. And I feel like I always talk to people and they were like, we're all chucking along, everything's great, and then COVID happened. It's like who are you before COVID and who are you after COVID?
It's so
And
true.
and nothing was happening, nothing anywhere was happening. And at that point, I was supervising a couple of things, here and there. I had a couple TV shows and I had a movie or so, but it wasn't anything exciting. It wasn't anything that was like, yes, this is it. And and then I had to pivot. I was like, I don't know what I'm gonna do because not only were TV shows not being produced, but no one could go to live events anymore either. So it was
Yeah.
like a double whammy. It's like everything that you do is gone, And I was just like, oh man, what do I do? Um, and I was really fortunate at that time. I was dating my now husband. And he worked at that time he worked in the podcast world, and podcasts were exploding. And it was really fun to like hear him do, to create this world. And he started a company called Wondery, and they're really famous for some really well-known podcasts like Dirty John and Dr. Death and Shrink Next Door, We Crashed. All of these ended up turning into TV shows, which was really fun. Um, and his team at one point, I think they were still like maybe 20. It was like a really small. Um, Reached out to me and they said, "Hey, we want to license this song for this podcast. Can you help us do it?" And I'm like, "I don't know how to license her podcast, but sure." I was like, I was desperate. I was like, "Great, can you pay me?" Like, and they're like, "Yeah." And I'm like, "Okay, cool." I was like, "Let's do it." I was like, "If you guys are willing to take this, like, go on this journey with me and, let me figure this out." I'm like, "I can't be that hard." And I'm like, they're like, "Cool." They're like, "What's the song?" I was like, "It's a Taylor Swift song." And I'm like, "Oh gosh, okay, that's gonna be expensive." And and then I went in, so I like emailed Universal and I'm just like, "Hey, I need to license this Taylor Swift song for a podcast." And they're like, "Podcast?" I'm like, "What?" I was like, "Who would I need to talk to?" And they're like, "We don't know." And they're like, "Just send me the request." And I'm like, "Okay." And so I just sent this guy this request and I'm like, "I need it." I was like, "I've got $500 in this budget, like, so it's like $250 aside." So in terms of like music, you have two sides to a song. So there's the underlying composition, which is like the notes and the lyrics. So if you're like looking at like sheet music, that's what it is. It's the actual notes and the lyrics that make up the actual song. So it's the composition. And then you have the recording. So you have the master recording. So you have two sides. So you have to clear both of those sides with all of the parties. Obviously sometimes the writer is not the same as the performer and vice versa. So I had to submit this kind of this request to do it. And I go, "I have $500 all in for this," which meant $250 aside, and I need it in perpetuity. And they were like, "Okay." And so I ended up, that was my first license, was this Taylor Swift song for $500 in perpetuity. And if you just think about that, like in nature, like just in general, like licensing Taylor Swift for anything is astronomical. It's so expensive. And so I just remember like, like no one knows what they're doing in this world as far as like licensing. I got this for like nothing, and I went back and I got the song for $500. Like it was unheard of. And so they came back again and they asked me, they're like, "Hey, we want to license this other song." I'm like, "Cool, I can do it." And then they came back again and they were like, "Hey, we want to commission an original theme song." And I'm like, "I can do that." And so I started seeing all of these things that I had gifts for, kind of like finally surfacing and be like, "Ah, it makes sense. Oh, that makes sense. Oh, that makes
Yeah.
sense." And I was able to like look back and it was like, "Great, we want to commission this song." I'm like, "Great, I can do that. I'm classically trained. I have this, whatever. I have, because I was working and doing these music festivals, especially with these low and mid liners, I know a ton of artists and I know a ton of songwriters that can do this. So I could be like, I know somebody. I know somebody who can write this. I know somebody who can get into the studio. I know a producer that wouldn't break the bank." That was the other thing. I was working with smaller budgets. So I needed to bring in people that either weren't in, signed to a label or signed to a publishing deal, so I could work fairly freely with them. And I also wanted to be able to work with the indie artists anyways, because, when you're working with a signed person, a lot of that money is going back to the label or back to the publisher, per their deal, if they're still having to
Yeah.
recoup something from an advance. And and I just remember I'm like, this makes so much sense now. Like, it was like at this, till this point, it was just like, where am I going? Where am I going? And then then it was just like, oh, this makes sense.
Light bulb.
And yeah. And so it was just like, I can do this, I can do this, I can do this. And I was like, I could take this side, this whole business side that I had learned, this music business side, and I know all the intricate nature of how labels work and how all of the PROs work, and the TV side that I had learned, for, for to be essentially be able to adapt it for the podcast. And then I ended up, I was starting to talk to the labels and publishers, and I was like, look, I think I'm the only one doing this right now, so let's go ahead and let's get ahead of this. Let's figure out how to set up these licensing protocols. And so I ended up setting up licensing protocols for how to license for podcasts for all of the major labels and the publishers. So if you're licensing something for a podcast now, it's because I got to sit down and write these protocols with them, on how to license correctly, on how to figure out, where it's going to appear as far as platforms. And like, I was just like, whoa, this is weird, because I walked in like, y'all, no one knows what they're doing. Let's just figure this out together. And it was a gray area for a long time, and it's still a little bit of a gray area, but it was fun being able to work with these clients. And they kept coming back for more. Like, that was great. That was great. Let's do it again. Let's do it again. And it, evolved into this really great symbiotic relationship where now, they're one of my biggest clients, and I've hired a couple of employees, and half my time is spent on writing music, creating music, composing music, and music supervising. And then also, I have to draft contracts and, work with legal. And so it was always just so weird, like, to look back, and it's like, I have all these like random things. I don't know really what to do. It's like, if you were making a smoothie out of all these things, it probably wouldn't have tasted very good, and I was like, what am I going to do with this? Just this like bag of just like junk, and it took so long to figure out, like, what am I going to do, and how am I going to do this, and how am I going to use all these weird talents that I have, and this weird approach to things, and make a living out of it. And it ended up, becoming this podcast world, and I very heavily still do TV and film music supervision, but this podcast thing, it kept coming back, and it kept saving me, every single time. COVID is what got me through COVID, because they were still able to produce and record podcasts. They just did it remotely, like kind of like what we're doing, now. We set up these virtual sessions, and we recorded entire productions from your living room, and it was really crazy to hear, to do that. And then, when the writer's strike happened and the actors strike, nobody really was doing something unless you had something in post production, that was still there. And again, podcasts saved me, again. So it was just like, man, it's definitely not as flashy as I kind of like hoped it would be, but it's like the amount of like creativity that I get to do, and the amount of like fulfillment that I get to do is fun. And it's like, and since I've been nominated for a bunch of awards, won a couple of awards, which is really nice. And yeah, it was like always having to be like an advocate for a platform that was still being discovered, and it was exhausting so many times to just have to be like, look at me, like, I promise you I can do something for you. And it's like, I didn't want to be that person. I didn't want to have to be the podcast guy. I didn't want to get labeled out. I wanted the flashy and TV and film stuff that I got a taste of when I came here. And I'm like, you know what? No one else is doing this though. No one else is doing this, so I can do what I want. I can create an environment that I want, to do it. I can tell other people we should do this, and they'll listen, because I'm literally the only person who's doing this. And it's evolved into this like really fun thing. And I talk to other music supervisors who, like, I'm like, this is how much creative freedom that I have, and they're like, that is insane. Like, it's insane that they're just like, go and do. And it's fun. We have like, we have this like clients, and I just have this like trust, and it's just like this understood thing. And they're like, you are going to deliver something great every single time. But also in the back end, I'm panicking because I have to, deliver something amazing every time. So every single time I send off something, I'm just sitting there going, like biting my nails, and I'm just like, oh my God. I was like, it's because you create the standard, that you want. And it's fun. It's so much fun. And I really love, what I do. And I love that I can bring in, like, when I write a custom song, I can just kind of sit back and like use like the chromesthesia aspect of things, and like I'll hear something and it's just like painting with my mind. It's like, I really love the hook of the song because these colors are so great, and I would love it if I could bring in something that sounds like this because the texture of this instrument looks so cool, and it's just like rearranging things that you've heard, and you're like painting a visual picture. in your mind. And it's just like it was so weird to like it was so weird to be able to use this random thing that I had, to be able to work with, and it's fun. And I just really enjoy what I do. And kind of like looking back, it's always like, man, like this is like I was a weird kid. Like I was such a weird kid, and nothing about me made sense at all. And it was like, how long is this going to take for me to like look back, or how long is this going to take for me to be able to like make sense of like this, And I'm like, what is this going to be, And eh, yeah, and then just like looking back and growing up sheltered, there was, now it looks back as a great. There was a reason because it forced me to like adapt and like really jump into music and really crave listening to music or crave watching everything that I could and listening to everything that I could because I was playing catch up, and it just really forced me to like look at everything. And I think that's where I'm thankful looking back, like that I grew up the way that I did because it forced me to go into something and learn things that I probably wouldn't have really sought out if I had just been kind of like, here, it's readily available. It's kind of like
Yeah.
goes back to you always want to do something when you're told you can't do it, and I was always like, I'm going to show you, I'm going to do it, and that was kind of like always like my mentality. I wasn't a defiant kid, but I was always like, you can't, like you can't tell me what to do, like I was very much like an independent person always from like day one. So I was like, I'm going to go off, I'm going to do my own thing. I'm going to move to Los Angeles. And going back to the hills thing, it's like now I live in the Hollywood Hills. So it's like you can call me Lauren Conrad from like now on. So but yeah, it's really weird to kind of like look back and just have this like full circle moment where it's like, man, you were a weird kid. You have weird talents. And back then I was like, they're not talents. They're just things that make you look weird and awkward and they make no sense to you. And now they're like superpowers, And it's just like,
Look at you
it's
now.
yeah, it's just like, man, like you look at us like I wish I could like look at myself or like talk to myself and just be like, you're gonna be okay, kid. Like you are weird and it is okay to be weird. It's okay to be gay. It's okay to not like yourself right now because you're going to like yourself later and you are going to like who you become and you're going to be proud of yourself. And that's all that matters. You proud of yourself, you getting to do something that you love and making sure that you are fulfilled. And yeah, I'm really fortunate to do something that I absolutely love every single
You
day.
can tell. I mean, you can tell, even from that. I mean, wow, that is a story and a half because, your passion absolutely comes through. And I think what you're saying is so true. It's obviously stemmed from your upbringing, being deprived of that kind of creative music and that licensing. So obviously that sort of made you who you are. And the other thing that I really pulled out from what you were saying was, we talk about, given the theme of the podcast, working class to world class, your mum and dad sacrifice, not giving you the luxuries, not giving you the big holidays, not going on the planes because they saved all the pennies or dollars, as you would say, to put you through college. And, if it wasn't for that, equally, we probably wouldn't be sitting here today. So,
Yeah.
I'm sure you owe them a lot of, gratitude, although
Yeah.
you weren't keen on certain things. The one thing I wanted to ask you, well, actually, there's a couple of things before we wrap up.
Yeah.
So when you hear my accent, so my Scottish accent, what colour do you associate it
Oh
with?
man. So everyone's voice for everyone's voices is in the same like wheelhouse. So
Okay.
it's all varying tones of like tan and browns. It's not sexy at all. So but like it's all, the lower it is, the more brown it is,
Yeah.
like the darker the color and the higher, like so yours is kind of like it's 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 just like it's a tan. It's like it's like it's I know, and it's like everyone always asks me that. They're like, I'm like, okay, here we go. It's like a party trick. But I mean, yeah, that's the thing. It's because a lot of times when you talk, you're talking at a monotone level. There's not a ton of just like
Yeah.
change. It's like when you change pitch, it will change a little bit.
Yeah.
But yeah, for the most part, everyone kind of sits in this like tan brown
So I got a
kind
tan.
of
I
like.
got a tan. That's fine. I always want a tan, preferably on my body. But I'm Scottish, so completely white. And the other thing I'm really keen to know, so you rhymed off a few people like Pitbull and people like that. So out of your career today, who is the most famous person you've ever worked with or ever been around?
Um, God, been around? Oh, been around.
Or
There's a
both? Yeah.
ton.
Or hung out. So hung out with or worked with.
I mean, I've hung out with Taylor Swift. I've hung out with Cher. I Beyonce. Um,
Just a few small names then.
Yeah, I mean, like, oh, this is actually a really fun one. So, a girl that I've known since she was 11. It was really fun. I met her. I booked her for this little talent show, or this. It was not a talent show. It was this really small music festival that I was working on, and she was 11 years old, and she walked in and she go, "This girl is amazing. She sang." And I'm like, "This is an 11-year-old voice. Like this was like an Aretha Franklin, like massive voice." And she was 11 and she was just very unassuming, child. And I was like, "You were going to do something." And I ended up becoming like really close with her mom, and I'm still really close with her mom today and her as well. And they were from Dallas, and then they ended up moving to Nashville. And she just told her mom, she goes, "I want to be a singer." And so they moved. They homeschooled her, moved the entire family, kids and everything, because she wasn't an only child, and moved to Nashville. And she started writing, and and I told her, I go, "You need to be patient, because coming from this A&R kind of like development background, no one's going to touch you until you're 16, because no one knows what's going to happen, when you hit puberty. They don't know how your voice is going to change, how it's going to be affected, how the range is going to change. And so just be just be patient and just write and get in rooms, sing, do whatever you can." And I remember that um, I got a call. They're like, "We've been having some meetings." I got them some meetings. I was like, "I had some meetings, and people are just like saying, great, like," and they told them what I told them. I go, "We can't, no one's going to touch you until you're 16. And then I ended up chatting with them on the phone, and her mom told me, they're like, "Something's happening. Can't tell you what, but something's happening." And she, so the girl I'm talking about, her name is Gail. And she had one of the biggest songs in the last 2 years. It's the song ABC, ABCDEFU. Yeah. And
Uh-huh.
so anyway, so it was this such amazingly talented girl, and she wrote the song when she was like 14 years old, and it was just sitting there. And she was like, "We can't announce it yet, but I'm about to get signed to Atlantic." And that was like her dream label. She was like, "I want to, because it's Aretha Franklin and it's soul and all of this stuff." And um and then that song took off. It was all over the radio. It was the number one in the world. It's garnered over, billions of streams. And she got nominated for Song of the Year at the Grammys that next year, against Taylor Swift and Lizzo and Bruno Mars. And it was insane that she was 17 years old, when she got nominated for that Grammy. And I just remember, like, "You are 11." You was like, "You will always be like kind of that 11-year-old girl, that I know." And it was really interesting. It was a really fun, like, it's just fun to kind of like look back, because when she had she had signed, but I guess it wasn't out there yet. It hadn't been fully announced. And my husband had gotten to a point with his company that he was ready to sell. And so he sold the company to Amazon. And we had a closing party with a lot of the Amazon people. It was Amazon Music, Audible, and then his team. And I was looking at I was like looking around. He asked me to bring in like someone to perform, to sing, just do like a performance. And I go, "Oh, I know somebody." And so I was talking to her. She did have a manager at the time that was already, because everything was already in motion. And I remember talking to her mom, and I was like, "She's going to perform a song that no one has heard yet, but we think is going to be pretty big." And I was like, "Is it okay if she says the F word?" And I'm like, "I don't know." And I was like, you know what? I was like, just go for it, whatever. So like the head of Amazon Music was there. I was like, maybe it'll bring something. And so she performed. And so the first time that song was ever performed live, the ABC was ever performed live, was at my house. And it was like a really cool, just kind of like thing to like look back on and be like, that was it. You had never performed that live before, and it was it.
Wow.
And she went on, and she was on tour with Taylor Swift. She opened for Taylor Swift, and then she went over to Europe and she toured with Pink. And so she was Pink support opening, and then she did a headlining tour back in the US, and then she is now going back on tour with Pink again and just blowing up with music. She had a song on the Barbie soundtrack, that was released, which was really cool.
I
And
loved it.
she did a song called Butterflies. It was a remake of a 90s kind of hip hop song. And it's been really cool. So she was like kind of the person that I've known, the best kind of like throughout everything. So
Wow, what a story. So see next time someone says to you, who is the most famous person you've hung out with? I hope I'm going to be on that list. So Lynn
it
Lester,
is
I want to hear the
Lynn.
lineup.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. And the final thought of on that celeb circle is when you met Taylor Swift, I hope you told her that you robbed her for $500.
I didn't want to be like, yeah.
You hustled her
Yeah,
record label
yeah.
or whatever. Exactly. So you get the one up. So thank you so much. This has been amazing. I think we could talk for much longer. I think this is only just scraping the surface of your story. But I guess maybe just to close out then, what would you say, and it might be, I've sort of got an idea of what you might say here, but not going to put words in your mouth. What would you say was the biggest adversity piece that ever happened to you growing up that made you who you are today, that actually became your superpower?
I honestly think it would probably be probably growing up gay. Like it was just like it was one of those things that was just like you're so lonely for a long time that you're always looking for, I guess what home is going to be, and home represented so many different things. It was, like it was like a safe haven. What is going to be safe for me? So, I was always looking for somewhere that I would fit in. And I would go there. I was like, great. I was like, I had a great group of friends, but it was like, no one is like me. I was like, the music thing, there wasn't a ton of people who were into like choral music, and like, or something like that, and it's like, great. I was like, where do I fit in? And I don't fit in. I was like, even in college, I didn't, even though I knew I was gay, I was like, I didn't hang out with anybody who was like me. And I think it took me, like again, like coming out, and I think a lot of queer people will tell you that it's just like it was so freeing, to be like, this is, and it was kind of like after that, it was like, great, like this is not going to be an adversity thing. I was like, this is who I am. I'm proud of it. And it was like after that, it was like everything kind of started making sense. It's like, oh, this cool talent, this cool talent, this cool talent. And I was like, oh, I met that person. We met at this whatever bar. He works at, Universal, or he works at this production company. Let's go talk. And it was just because we were gay, and I was like, great, let's go meet, let's just go whatever. Cause I didn't know anybody, and it was very much just like, it was kind of going back to, I need to talk to everybody that I can. But like the adversity thing, growing up in a small town, Waco, Texas, where you're told you're going to hell from day one, it's just kind of like, oh, there's a lot of baggage there, So I think like looking back,
Yeah.
and it's like, let's just, it's like, it's not a baggage thing. It's not, it's like, this is one person's opinion of me. And I was like, it take me like not
Yeah.
caring. It was just like learning to not care about what other people thought. And it's just like, you're you, this is what it is. If you don't like it, cool, bye. I don't have to be friends with you. I don't have to talk to you. I don't have to do whatever. And sometimes that was family members. Sometimes that was friends. Sometimes that was, whatever. And I gotta have distance. Gotta have distance between us, so I can handle
Yeah.
you in doses, whatever. But yeah, I think that just kind of like coming to terms and just like really embracing being gay, being queer, living in that world, and what better to do it? What better place to do it than West Hollywood in Los Angeles? So
In the hills. Absolutely. Well, I would say you have got plenty of superpowers, and that's just one of them there. So thank you so much. I think you're going to inspire a lot of people with your story. It's multifaceted. I think it's really it's just bemusing, like how all this stuff happened to you, and just your journey to get to where you are today. So I'm sure your parents, I'm sure everyone's very proud of you, and thank you so much for being on this today.
Of course. Thanks for having me, Lynn.